What if I told you that one small country holds the secrets of ancient civilizations, volcanoes that shape the earth, a booming yet divided economy, and over 20 unique cultures, all thriving side by side? That's Guatemala. And its story begins over 25,000 years ago, when early humans crossed a frozen land bridge from Asia into North America. Over time, they spread south. And by 11,000 BC, the Clovis people had arrived, hunting giant mammals with stone tools in what's now Central America. But as the Ice Age ended and the big animals disappeared, survival meant adaptation. Farming took root. And early crops like squash, peppers, beans, and wild maize laid the groundwork for what would become one of the most iconic civilizations in the Americas. By 1800 BC, the Maya entered the scene. Influenced by the Olmecs of Mexico, also known as the mother culture of Mesoamerica, the Maya started building pyramids, developing a calendar, and writing glyphs. Plus, farming innovations like irrigation and terracing allowed cities to flourish. In fact, Nakbe and El Mirador were among the earliest urban centres, with El Mirador housing up to 100,000 people by 100 BC. These weren't just cities, they were thriving hubs of astronomy, trade, and ceremonial life. But around 150 AD, it all came crashing down. Droughts, volcanic eruptions, and warfare caused cities like El Mirador and Caminal Juyu to collapse. Still, the Maya weren't finished. Between 250 and 900 AD, they reached their golden age. Cities like Tikal, Copan, and Calakmul rose to power, building massive temples and recording history on stone monuments called stelae. And as a result, art, math, and astronomy thrived once more. Then came the decline. By 750 AD, trade routes had collapsed, alliances crumbled, and city-states turned on one another. Centuries of deforestation likely sparked severe droughts, setting off waves of famine and rebellion. And by the end of the 9th century, most major cities lay abandoned. But the Maya didn't vanish. They migrated. Many moved to the Yucatan, Belize, and southern Guatemala, while smaller highland tribes adapted to mountain life through terraced farming. As the lowlands emptied, the highlands were growing more complex. By the 1200s, Toltec Maya hybrids from central Mexico had moved in, founding new kingdoms like the Quiche, Kaqchikel, and Mam. Unfortunately, the region was divided and constantly at war, and that division would open the door to the Spanish. In 1523, Pedro de Alvarado arrived with a small Spanish force. The Quiche fought back, but were crushed. And legend has it, Alvarado personally killed their leader, Tecún Umán, before burning the capital to the ground. Other groups, like the Kaqchikel, initially allied with the Spanish, only to realise they were next. In 1526, they turned on their former allies, retreating into the mountains to wage guerrilla war. Still, the Spanish advanced. Some tribes, such as the Quechua and Achi, converted peacefully after being approached by Dominican friar Bartolomé de las Casas. Then, within 3 years, most of the highlands had fallen under Spanish control. But the deadliest part of the conquest wasn't the war, it was disease. Smallpox, measles, and typhus swept through the population, wiping out nearly 75% of Guatemalans within 3 decades. Then, in 1541, disaster struck again. A massive mudslide buried the colonial capital. Survivors relocated a few miles away to what would become Antigua. The city, renamed Santiago de los Caballeros, soon became the administrative center of Spanish Central America, governing everything from Chiapas to Costa Rica. At its peak, Antigua was the 3rd largest city in Spanish America, but it was also a place of deep inequality. Spaniards at the top, indigenous people at the bottom, many forced into hard labor under a brutal system known as the encomienda. Religious orders like the Dominicans and Franciscans owned huge tracts of land, farming crops like sugar and indigo with indigenous labor. They also built churches, schools, and hospitals, shaping both the faith and infrastructure of the colony. But the system was far from fair. In theory, encomenderos were supposed to protect and educate the locals. In practice, they overworked, taxed, and controlled them. Even after encomienda was reformed, it was replaced by repartimiento, a new system that still relied on forced labour, just under a different name. And by the late 1500s, The Spanish had rounded up indigenous groups into 700 new settlements called reducciones, designed to civilize and control them. Fast forward to 1808. Napoleon invades Spain, installs a liberal constitution, and the ripple effect reaches Guatemala. Mexico declares independence in 1821, and Guatemala follows, well, sort of. The conservative elites in the church didn't want to lose control, so the transition was mostly symbolic. Guatemala was soon absorbed into Mexico's short-lived empire under Agustín de Iturbide. But when that collapsed in 1823, Guatemala joined a new Central American federation. The federation adopted a US-style constitution and abolished slavery, but ideological divisions quickly emerged. On one hand, conservatives wanted to keep power centralized in the church and elite families. On the other hand, liberals pushed for reform and equality. In 1830, liberal forces led by Honduran General Francisco Morazán brought sweeping change. Under Mariano Galvez, Guatemala saw trial by jury, civil marriage, educational reform, and even the abolition of the death penalty. But not everyone was on board. By the late 1830s, a young military leader named Rafael Carrera rose up with the support of rural and indigenous groups. They felt alienated by the reforms, and Carrera gave them a voice. So, by 1844, Carrera took control. He reversed liberal changes, restored church authority, and reinstated Spanish land titles. And in 1847, Guatemala officially left the Central American Federation and became fully independent. But that's far from where the story goes. Because if you truly want to understand Guatemala in all its glory, you also need to take a look at its landscape. Nearly 2/3 of Guatemala is rugged highlands, which was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, the fertile valleys between the peaks produce some of the world's finest coffee. On the other, frequent volcanic eruptions, landslides, and earthquakes have destroyed cities, blocked roads, and made development a constant uphill climb, literally. Geographically, Guatemala is tucked into the northwest corner of Central America. It borders Mexico to the north and west, Belize and the Caribbean to the east, Honduras and El Salvador to the southeast, and the Pacific Ocean to the south. It may be compact, roughly the size of Tennessee, but it packs in a wild range of environments. In fact, it's the third largest country in Central America by land area, spanning just 108,890 square kilometres, or nearly 43,000 square miles. But don't let the stats fool you, because at its widest point, it stretches just 280 miles, or 450 kilometres from north to south. Still, that small footprint holds a lot of extremes. You've got towering peaks like Volcan Tajumulco, the highest in Central America, at over 13,800 feet, or approximately 4,206 metres. And just a few hours away are steamy rainforests and low-lying mangrove coasts. Head to Lake Atitlan, often called the most beautiful lake in the world. It's surrounded by volcanoes and highland villages, making it perfect for hiking, kayaking, or just soaking in the view. So, how is the land divided? Two major mountain ranges slice across the country from west to east. South of them lies the Pacific coast, flat, humid, and fertile. North of the mountains, the Petén, a sprawling forested lowland where ancient Maya cities like Tikal are hidden beneath a thick jungle canopy. In between, there are the highlands. This central region sits on the Motagua Fault, where the Caribbean and North American tectonic plates grind against each other, which means lots of earthquakes. Then, off the Pacific coast lies the Middle America Trench, a deep fault line that fuels the volcanic activity across southern Guatemala. One of the major volcanic chains is called the Sierra Madre, and it stretches from the Mexican border all the way toward Guatemala City. But all this shifting earth has shaped a landscape that's nothing short of spectacular. Guatemala is ranked among the top 5 biodiversity hotspots in the world. Across 14 different ecoregions, you'll find cloud forests, wetlands, pine woodlands, jungles, and more. And with that terrain comes lots of wildlife. You've got parrots, toucans, wild turkeys, even the endangered scarlet macaw. But the real showstopper, the quetzal, with its shimmering green feathers and crimson chest, it's not just the national bird, it's a living symbol of the country. Catching a glimpse in the highlands feels like spotting a flying jewel. On the ground, you might run into jaguars, howler monkeys, ocelots and pumas. In the rivers and swamps, crocodiles, turtles, freshwater shrimp. And out at sea, the coastlines are teeming with fish, crabs, lobsters and more. And along the Pacific coast, a narrow stretch of volcanic soil has been transformed into rich farmland, where sugarcane, rubber and cattle now dominate what was once tropical forest. So, knowing this, which part of the country would you love to explore first? The highlands, the jungle ruins of Petén, or the volcanic lake views of Atitlan? Sound off in the comments section below. While you think about that, here's something else to consider. Guatemala is much more than its landscape and ancient ruins. It's also a major economic player. In fact, it's considered the largest economy in Central America. With a population of over 18 million and a GDP of nearly $109 billion in 2024, Guatemala leads the region in both size and economic activity. So, what's fueling this growth? Over the past decade, Guatemala has averaged a steady 3.5% annual growth rate, driven by smart fiscal policies, an open economy, and stable monetary management. In 2024, the country even outperformed expectations, growing by 3.7%. And for 2025, another 3.5% is on the horizon, thanks to rising credit access and remittances sent home by Guatemalans living abroad. But before we get too excited, there's actually a downside to this, because over half the country still lives in poverty. In fact, in 2024, about 57.3% of Guatemalans survived on an average of less than $7 a day. That's more than 10 million people living on the edge, despite the country's solid economic performance. And while projections show slight improvements, with poverty expected to dip to 56.6% by 2026, the pace is slow. Why? Because the challenges run deep, starting with jobs. Roughly 80% of workers are employed in the informal sector. That means no contracts, no benefits, and no real protections. Wages are low, job security is shaky. And only 1 in 3 women is part of the labour force, giving Guatemala one of the lowest female participation rates in the region. Add to that a mix of social exclusion, geographic inequality, and frequent natural disasters, and it's easy to see why so many Guatemalans leave in search of better opportunities. But here's the twist. Those who leave, they still give back. In 2024, Guatemalans abroad sent home remittances equal to nearly 20% of the country's GDP, which is a staggering amount. That money helps families, supports small businesses, and keeps the economy afloat. In fact, remittances grew by 8.6% in just 1 year. Still, depending so heavily on money from abroad is a sign of deeper problems at home. Because the truth is, Guatemala has enormous untapped potential. This country is rich in natural resources, ranks among the world's mega-diverse nations, and holds incredible cultural wealth. So, the real challenge now is turning that raw potential into sustainable, inclusive growth. That's exactly what newly elected President Bernardo Arévalo promised to do. He took office in January 2024, campaigning on a platform of social investment, anti-corruption, and structural reform. And so far, he started delivering, expanding public spending, improving infrastructure, and even passing Guatemala's first ever antitrust law. But here's the catch. Bold ideas are only as good as their execution. Right now, the government still struggles with efficiency, and unless that improves, meaningful change could stall. Yes, the foundation is there and the momentum is building. But the next few years will determine whether Guatemala can finally turn growth into real progress for everyone. Because at the end of the day, it's the people that bring Guatemala to life. Did you know that the country is home to over 20 different Mayan ethnic groups, like the Quiche, Kaqchikel, Mam, and Quechua? While most live in the highlands, the Ladinos, those of mixed Mayan and European descent, tend to live in cities and lowlands. Then there's the Garinagu, an Afro-Indigenous group that settled along the Caribbean coast. Their culture, music, and language, especially in the town of Livingston, stand apart from the rest of the country. So, you might be wondering, how does all this diversity coexist? Well, a big part of the answer is religion. The Maya have long-honoured nature. Mountains, rivers, caves, and stars. Many still practice ancient ceremonies in caves or at ruins. Then, when the Spanish arrived, they brought Catholicism, which became dominant for centuries. But after the 1976 earthquake, many rural villages converted to evangelical Christianity through aid efforts, and today about a third of the population are Protestants. Now, it's common to see all three beliefs, Mayan spirituality, Catholicism, and evangelical Christianity, blended together in daily life. And that shows up in Guatemala's festivals too. Vibrant parades, spiritual traditions, and incredible food. As for language, Spanish is the official language, but Guatemala is wildly multilingual, with 23 Mayan languages, plus Garifuna and Xinca. But despite that, Spanish here is clear and easy to learn. Because of that, Guatemala is a top destination for language schools, especially in Antigua and Quetzaltenango. Guatemala is complex, beautiful, and absolutely worth knowing. So, among everything you've learnt so far, which one was the most intriguing one? And as always, if you enjoyed this video, you'll love this next one.